Okay, so thank you for coming back. I'm happy to see that I didn't lose everyone after the first one. So I appreciate your participation. So this class, we're going to talk specifically about the new 3dsmax.net API. So we're going to give an introduction to how to create a project and how to consume the API and work with it within 3ds Max. So I'm the same guy as before. And I think everyone was here for the first session, right? Anyone who was not here for the first? Okay, good. So I don't have to cover this again. So what we're going to talk about in this class is, how to create a .NET assembly that's compatible with 3ds Max. We're going to use .NET API to solve common tasks through automation and customization. We'll show you how to create a WPF-style UI within 3ds Max. And we'll get a couple of different techniques there. And then we're going to manipulate some 3ds Max geometry using .NET API. So first of all, how many people already work in .NET API? Anyone? C#? One person? Okay, great. So I'm going to start by just giving you an introduction to generally what .NET API technology is. So it started as a software architecture framework from Microsoft. It's Windows specific. It's used on all of their platforms now. So you've heard us talk a lot about cloud and mobile at this event. And so the nice thing about using .NET is that it spans into these other areas as well. It's not just desktop. You can use it to program Microsoft's Azure cloud services. You can use it for Microsoft's mobile platforms. I have the phone 7, but they have newer phones out now. They have their own tablets now. And all of those devices can be programmed using .NET technology. So the fundamental aspect of it is that programs execute in what's called the CLR, which is the Common Language Runtime. Okay? So what that is a layer within the platform itself. So within Windows, for example, you install the .NET framework and it becomes an execution engine within Windows. Okay? So we call these programs managed programs. So you've probably heard that term if you've been reading or looking at anything .NET API related. The programs are managed by this common language interface. Okay? So for example, you get things like memory management through a garbage collection facility. So when you allocate something, as long as the API is set up correctly, the platform will deallocate it when it's no longer being referenced or used. So that gives it a huge advantage over something like C++, where you have to manage everything, and if you don't get it right, you're going to crash the system, and it's very easy to cause whatever you're programming to go down just by making a mistake in your code. So the .NET environment gives you a lot of safety and a lot of ease in programming. Okay, so it allows you to concentrate on programming rather than some of these other details. So if we take a look at what it looks like, so at the lower level is the Common Language Runtime, and then Framework 2 has the base class library and some of the basic services. So for example, WinForms, ASP.NET, and ADO.NET will work in the 2.0 framework. Okay, so that goes back to Windows XP, 5 or 6 years ago, even longer, I guess, for these components. As the framework has matured over time, we go into 3.0, and this is where WPF, WCF, WF was all introduced. So this is the Presentation Foundation, Communication Foundation, and the Workflow Foundations. When we move into 3.5, you get things like LINQ, which is List Interpreted Query Language. ADO.NET now has been expanded, and they introduced the Entity Framework here. And then 4.0, Parallel Link, Task Parallel, so they did parallel technologies to support multi-core and making it more sophisticated. And 4.5 is already out as well. So you consume these things based on the framework level, and 3ds Max will work all the way up through the 4.5 layer, and you can consume all the components that are available to you through 4.5, and you consume them through this thing called the Common Language Specification. Okay, so Common Language Specification is basically Microsoft said, if you give me code in this format, I'll execute it for you. Okay, so it's a very low-level specification, and what that does is allows Microsoft and other vendors to create their own language syntax that will go through this common language and run in a common way at the CLR. So Visual Studio is Microsoft's tool, and you can choose VB.NET, C#, C++, CLI. There's F#, which is functional programming, and even separate from Microsoft, other languages are available. So there's a managed Fortran, for example. Does anyone who knows what Fortran is? Have you heard of Fortran? No. That's because I'm old and you're not. You've heard of Fortran? Yeah. Fortran used to be the C++ of the world. That's what all engineers use to program and do their work with. So, and that's the cool thing about the .NET environment is that it's this that defines how it executes, not this. As long as these compile down into this, you can use any language you want. I've seen people use, is it Iron Python, which is a managed version of Python. That's possible. It's not a real Python if you talk to a hardcore Python programmer, but it is Python syntax. So it gives you the power of C++ type programming with the simplicity of scripting. It uses simple referencing and has this idea of reflection, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The language choices, basically you could have your colleague using VB.NET and you choosing C#, and you're consuming the same APIs. You're just using a different language to do so. It is a modern development environment. No matter how much I hear people say, Java's where it's at and Android programming is awesome, and that is really cool, but you're using a tool called Eclipse, and it's open source, and it works great. But for me, Visual Studio is one of the best developer tools out on the that's ever been written. It's really, really good. It's got great debugging capabilities. The tool itself is nice. So, and then we keep hearing, is it Windows only? Well, in the case of 3ds Max, it is, because we only provide 3ds Max in the Windows platform. But the technology itself is now opening up. So, first of all, Microsoft has released the source to their .NET framework. So you can actually look at the internal workings of how it works. And what that's led to is the Mono project, and I think there's other now, that are their own implementations of .NET framework and the ability to program. And the Mono project, for example, supports the Mac and Linux. So although 3ds Max doesn't run there, the technology is, being consumed in other places than just Windows. So what you need to keep in mind is that .NET is a specification, not a language. So you'll hear people say, C# or VB.NET. So those are languages. But .NET is the generic underlying component to it. And it's a specification. And that's what I said, it enables people to write new languages, to run on different platforms, that sort of thing. It includes many modern foundation technologies. So the WCF, which would include ASP and Azure and all the cloud stuff that Microsoft is providing. User interface stuff. WPF is a really nice, powerful environment for creating user interfaces. Microsoft is now starting to embrace HTML5. So I think that we'll see WPF use start to kind of go away over time. But it's a very fast and nice environment to create a user interface. So if you're writing a program in 3ds Max, there's no reason not to use it. And Windows Workflow Foundation is just another one of these frameworks that you can consume. And we mentioned this in the earlier class. You know, the other Autodesk products already have pretty mature .NET APIs. Revit, for example, you know, that's its primary API interface. So let's just talk a little bit more about reflection, because what reflection can do for you is help you to learn the API itself without having to go to documentation and ask questions, because reflection allows this runtime type discovery. So what it allows you to do is actually execute things that you may not know until you are running. So when an assembly is loaded, you can do something like, okay, I know this assembly is here. I can go and query that assembly for all of its data, which would include its interfaces, classes, methods, and properties. And the metadata that's stored in the assembly will tell you all of that information. And at runtime, you can interpret that, and you can actually execute APIs that you may not have even known about until you were running and queried the assembly. It's similar to using a tool such as ILDASM, which is a tool that comes with the .NET tool set. This will basically decompile assemblies and allow you to look inside of them. So it runs them. So it creates a runtime environment, queries everything, and then it will list everything for you. There's some third-party tools as well, and I'll give you an example in a minute. So again, within a given assembly, you can find all the types and their interfaces. And this is similar to the idea of late binding, which was referred to often when we talked about VBA. So VBA is kind of going away. The COM automation ideas are going away. But it's the same fundamental principle, is at runtime, you're looking at the assembly and getting its information. So that brings us into the .NET API. Let's just talk about, you know, its history a little bit, just so you understand when and where it came into play. So it's been part of 3ds Max for a number of years, but it was mainly for the UI elements. So in the morning class, I talked about the ribbon, and that's the primary reason we got .NET in Max in the first place. So the framework was implemented, and it was at that time implemented to support interop through MaxScript. So to answer that question you had earlier, you can actually write functions in .NET and call them from MaxScript. There's some specialized MaxScript syntax that allows you to call directly into your .NET API libraries. And it was also used a lot for C++ CLI. So you heard that the SDK is like the really powerful environment for creating C++, but it uses some of the older Windows primitive user interface ideas. So you have access just to the older controls and that sort of thing. You don't have access to what WPF provides you, for example. So what many people did was they created a managed WPF user interface and then another component using C++ CLI, which is managed C++ from Microsoft. And that created a bridging environment that then you can call managed and unmanaged code in the same DLL, and that allows you to interface with pure native C++. Okay? So this gives you a lot of capability, but it's also kind of tricky to get it working, and it can be dangerous. So this new enhanced version, which provides access to the scene, kind of eliminates the need for this idea of mixed mode. So now you can just use and consume this new assembly, and we call it the new enhanced functionality, and that gives you direct access to the scene. So it was introduced in 2012 in the Subscription Advantage Pack, and it's called Autodesk.max.dll. Okay, so this is the new assembly that provides the scene access. And again, it is a one-to-one wrapper of the native C++ APIs. So everything that's in C++, in theory, is exposed to the .NET API. So to get started in learning, some resources here. So the help for the 3ds Max SDK contains 2 topics to help get you started. The first thing you'll want to do working with .NET API, even though you won't need to consume much out of the SDK, is install the SDK. So the very first thing you should do is get the SDK and install it. You're going to see a lot of C++ stuff in there. Just ignore it. And that gives you the links to the documentation. The documentation is online, so you don't necessarily have to install the SDK, but I encourage you to do it because the techniques that you'll program in .NET API are the same ones in C++. And we have very few .NET API examples and a whole bunch of C++ examples. So even though the coding is different, the techniques to do things are the same. So you can look at the C++ samples and get an idea of, oh, how do I create a new animation controller and add it to an object, for example. Okay? If you do need to work in the 2012 Subscription Advantage Pack, I provided a link that talks about how to do that specifically. If you have a choice, I would encourage you to get 2013 or 2014 just because it's more stable and it's in the box. You don't have to have these 2 things installed separately. With this environment, you need to have 3ds Max 2012 plus the Subscription Advantage Pack installed on top of it. So the wrapper assembly is, again, called autodesk.max.dll. In order to get documentation, again, you have to go to the C++ reference as the main form. We don't have any specific .NET API documentation other than those 2 topics on the previous screen. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is version 1. So as with anything version 1, it's not perfect out of the box. So just keep that in mind as you're working that you may run into some problems. And this is where ADN can help you. If you do run into problems in having ADN membership, we can directly get you answers from engineering. Even though it's now in 2012 Subscription Advantage Pack, 2013, 2014, it hasn't changed much. They fixed a few bugs, but they haven't done much else to it. The main thing to learn it, to use to learn it would be to use an assembly browser of some sort. So when we were on the reflection page, it's that idea that you can open the assembly outside of the running environment of 3ds Max in this case and look directly at the APIs. So Visual Studio has the object browser. There's an open source tool called ILSpy, and that's what I use from time to time because you can run it outside of Visual Studio and it's free, open source. And there's another third-party tool called Reflector, and that one is really good, but it used to be free and now you actually have to pay for it, so it costs a little bit of money. And also remember that there's multiple assemblies that you will consume, and we'll talk about those in a second. But don't get hung up on just using the new one, because the older ones can help you to do user interface things and bind those to the 3ds Max UI. So these are the assemblies that make up the 3ds Max.NET API. 2012, we had one less file. So that's why one difference, I would encourage you to just start in 2013 or 14. We'll talk about each one of these. So first of all, the Autodesk.Max is this new enhanced functionality. Autodesk.Max is the root namespace. You need to use some basic APIs to get entry into 3ds Max APIs, and they're called iGlobal, and we're currently at interface 14. So this interface is versioned, and so depending on the functionality you need, if it's a new feature, you might have to go to the next version of the interface. And this is just to keep things version independent. So if you're using interface 14 and you're going forward, those interfaces are never going to change. Anything new will be introduced in the next interface version. The way the API was created, so I mentioned in the earlier class that these are wrappers around the C++ APIs, but they did want to make some attempt to make them nicer for the .NET API. So what they did was they took all the functions in the C++ SDK that took 0 arguments. So like, I don't know, get node. And if it begins with the word get, they're mapped to properties. Okay? So this is helpful to know when you're first learning, because in the .NET API, it might just be, so let's say the C++ API is get current node. In .NET API, it would be called just so it would be called get current node in C++ and current node in .NET API. And it would be a property instead of a function. Okay? So they tried to basically convert all of these things that would be considered properties in .NET API to actual real properties. Things that can be instanced. So certain types, like for example the point 3 that represents a point structure in the SDK. In order to create those, you have to call a method of create. You can't just say new point 3. Because the memory allocation has to be done on the C++ side underneath. So we provide these helper create functions that will construct the memory properly, and it sets it up for garbage collection and will not, cause any problems with 3ds Max on the native side. So you have to remember that when you want to construct something, you'll have to look for the create methods for that type. So there's an iGlobal point 3 create method to create a point 3, for example. And then the other thing that's a little bit tricky to get used to when you first start working in it is that class IDs are used to identify object types. So this is from the C++ side. Any type of class, so for example the geosphere that we talked about earlier, it has a unique class ID that identifies it. And that's the primary way you would construct it. So instead of saying new geosphere to construct that type of object, you have to go and get its class ID, and then you say create an object of this class ID, and what that will give you back is a geosphere. So you construct and you work with objects using the class ID as the primary way to identify what it is. So the assemblies, the other assemblies are UI view models. So this contains the CUI functionality. So this is one of the primary ways, the easiest way to hook into 3ds Max for being able to call your managed code. In 2012, it was in this Max Custom Controls. So they basically created this new assembly for 2013 and 14. There's another assembly called Assembly Loader, and this contains a loader class that will allow you to manually load assemblies as you need them. This is not required because if you put the assembly in a specific location, it will load automatically. So you only need this for these specific cases of when you need to load other assemblies or you need to do some kind of initialization upon startup. The C# utilities, managed services, and Max custom controls. So each one of these contains just various utilities. Unfortunately, they're not structured well. So I encourage you to use the object browser, for example, to look at what's in there and see when you're trying to find something to help you. So definitely worth exploring. And one of the big things that they contain is ways of interacting with WPF and the 3ds Max window, for example. So there's lots of window type utilities, getting the Windows handle and being able to interop with Windows stuff. And then there's two other assemblies, Explorer Framework and Scene Explorer, which may or may not be that useful. These were assemblies that were available before the wrapper assembly came along. And so this was the only access you had to the scene before. They're not that useful anymore with the new assembly. So let's just take a look at these assemblies real quick. So I've got this open source tool called ILSpy. It's a free tool. It's open source, so you can actually look at the source code for it. And this is an assembly browser. Okay. So what I have loaded here is, let's go up here to the top. The Autodesk.Max assembly. And you can see, so this is just the DLL that's been loaded. 3ds Max itself doesn't have anything to do with this running instance of the assembly. So it's ILSpy that's running and reflecting the information and showing it through their user interface. So I can go to Autodesk.Max, for example, and you can see, all of the different APIs that are available in that assembly. Okay, so for example, we talked about the 0.3, for example. So here's the 0.3 type. Here's all the properties, and here's all the methods on that type. Okay, so you can even look, and it will sometimes give you documentation right here with the API. So this is a pretty convenient way of looking at the types within the assembly. All right. Now, if we go to Visual Studio, it has the same idea called the object browser. So it's the same notion, it's just running inside of Visual Studio this time. So I could go to Autodesk.Max, and again go to the point class, and I'm going to get the same information here. Okay, it's just presented in a slightly different way. The object browser gives you a little nicer documentation. So you can see here it put that comment in a nice paragraph to read from. Okay, the only drawback is you have to have Visual Studio running to look at it, and that's may or may not be fine. The other thing that's kind of a tip here is to make use of Visual Studio in a really smart way. So first of all, when you load a project, typically the project will load in this mode of My Solution. Okay? And when you're in that mode, it gives you all the assemblies that are referenced, including the sub-assemblies. So you can see there's a lot of system assemblies here. There's the presentation framework. There's the Microsoft Core library. So not just the ones that I'm working on with 3ds Max, but everything that the managed environment is using to create this program. So the drawback to having all of these is that when you search, it's going to find that keyword in all of those assemblies. So for example, if you look for window, all the Microsoft stuff is going to also come into the search results. So there's a way here that you can subset the components that you want. It's called Custom Component Set. And what that does is that narrows down the number of assemblies that are displaying. When you search, you'll only find results from that subset. And to create it is you just simply change the drop down to Custom Component Set. In the beginning, it'll be empty. And to change it, you just open up the dialog box. This will take a minute to load. But it will basically allow you to choose the assemblies that you want to search. And it basically shows you all of the assemblies that are available to you through a browsing window. You can come over here and select the standard components, etc. Okay? And then down at the bottom is what your current component set is. And that gives you this ability to just look at, in this case, we want to just see the 3ds Max assemblies, so when you're searching for things, you're finding them within context. So to create a project, it's very easy. That we don't have any kind of wizard because you really don't need anything special to create a new project. You just simply create a new managed class library project in the language that you're choosing. So you'd go to C#, for example, and say class library. And then you reference the assemblies you want. And as soon as you reference them, you should get in the habit, and that's why this is highlighted, because it's really important. You need to set the attribute copy local to false on any of the 3ds Max assemblies. Okay, and this is really important because of the way we release our assemblies. Our assemblies are not registered in the Microsoft's global assembly cache. So our assemblies are versioned based on the product that they're running within. So the assembly that resides with 3ds Max 2014 is the assembly that's meant to run with that version of 3ds Max, and you can't mix them. When the default is when copy local is true, what it does is it says, take that assembly that I just browsed from the 3ds Max directory and copy it to my project, and that's the assembly I'm going to always use. And then if you decide, okay, I'm going to bring this assembly forward to the next version of Max, it brings that assembly along with it, and it's going to cause problems because that assembly is no longer meant for a different version of Max. So you need to get in the habit of making sure copy local is set to false. And then the last thing is to make sure to place the assembly in this specific folder. So wherever 3ds Max is installed, there's a subfolder called bin, and within that there's an assemblies folder. You put your DLL in that directory, and Max will see it as a managed assembly, and it's going to load it. Okay, and that's why I said earlier it's an automatic loading mechanism. As long as it's in the right place, it'll load it for you. Okay. The other thing to remember is that Max iterates that entire directory. So if you're working on like a mixed mode program, or you have some satellite assemblies that aren't meant for Max, or not, they don't need to be loaded by Max because you're loading them yourself, don't put them in this directory because Max will iterate that directory, and anything that it recognizes as a managed assembly, it will try and load it, and if it doesn't find the entry points, it may issue an error. Okay, so if you see some weird errors, that's a tip for you to check and see if you accidentally copied something there that wasn't meant for Max loading. All right, so let me just switch back over here. So I'm going to start a new instance of Visual Studio. I'm going to say New Project. I want C#, so I'll choose Visual C#. And here's the class library. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and create a project. You know, there's no specialized wizard or anything, so I basically get a stubbed out, basic, generic managed program. So then the very first thing I'll do is I'll come over to References and I'll say Add Reference. And depending on your language, that referencing may be different. VB.NET, you have to go to the properties to add them. But when you add reference, you need to say Browse. Okay? Our assemblies, again, are not registered in the global assembly cache, so they will not show up on this .NET tab. Okay? None of our assemblies are listed here. So you have to go to Browse, and you'll just browse to your 3ds Max folder. Let me see, where's mine? It's so here's 3ds Max Design 2014. So these are all of the executables. So I only want the managed files, and all of our assemblies are DLL, so that will help narrow it down if you just do the pattern search. And then you have to kind of go by name. So I know that I want Autodesk.Max, for example. There it is. And I say OK. Okay, and it will show up in my references. Now, who remembers what I should do? First thing, copy local. So I go to the assembly itself, and in the properties for that assembly, I come down here, and this attribute right here, you can see it defaults to true, and I need to change that to false. And you should do that before you do a build at all, just so you don't get an instance of that DLL copied over. So when it says copy local false, it references the assembly from its location where you browsed it from. And that's exactly what you want. You want it to stay in the 3ds Max directory where it belongs, where it lives. All right? So it's just a nuance of how Microsoft set up the tools. And that's all I have to do to create the basic project. The only thing I need to start doing now is coding. Okay? That's enough. So to talk about how to be loaded and initialized, what we're going to do in this class is we're going to use the CUI action facility. So this gives you the an easy way to hook into the UI using the action system, and this will show up in this customized user interface, which we saw in the first class. And this is available from the UI view model DLL, so you need to reference that one. You could also use assembly loader, so this gives you some initialization capabilities, etc., but it doesn't give you this connection to customized user interface. So at a minimum, to get managed code to run here, you would have to have a block of code to create the user interface that you could select it from. So for example, you would have to create some SDK code to add a menu item to some menu in the UI so that the user could push the button and run it. Whereas this gives it to you almost for free. Okay? So I encourage you, when you get started, regardless of if you want a really nice UI later, start here, and you can easily change it to this later if you want. So the first thing you're going to do to use the CUI is you're going to derive from this base class called CUI Action Command Adapter, or you can just simply implement the interface. Okay? Deriving from gives you, it's a little bit less work, so that's the approach I took. But if you want a really flexible one, you can implement this interface, and all you have to do is implement the minimum functions, and this will work as well. And again, depending on whether you're in 2012 or 2013-14, the assembly is different to get this. Okay? And then you implement the necessary functions, and it's mostly strings to identify it properly to max, and then there's a single execute that will allow you to run the code. Okay, so when the action is chosen, no matter where it resides in the user interface, it's going to call into the execute to run it. So let's go over here. I'm going to close this project. All right. So let's start. Where am I at? Max. So I'm going to execute this, and you can see here that it jumps into my code, and by just implementing this string, I automatically have the UI element that displayed in the menu, and implementing execute allows me to jump into the code and actually run something within the Max API. And we saw this earlier, so all I did was, where did it go? I might have jumped over it. Okay, so there you can see the string that it pushed. Okay. So using this new functionality, you're going to reference Autodesk.Max, and again, it contains the entire C++ SDK as these crude wrappers. Okay, so it's a kind of a one-to-one mapping. But that's what allows you to look at the C++ documentation, the C++ samples, and you can emulate those same techniques in managed code. Autodesk.Max is the root namespace, and again, just a reminder, make sure you start by using iGlobal and the I interface 14 as your entry points into the API. We talked about functions with 0 arguments and get are mapped to properties. So that's just a reminder to make sure when you're trying to learn this and you look in the SDK, it may have the name get in front of it. So it's the same API, but it's just named slightly different. Anything that is instanced, you need to use class IDs and the create method to create those geometry types or those object types. And there's two create instance routines. There's one off of iGlobal, and this one is almost never used. So just be careful and make sure you're always using the iInterface version of create instance. Okay? So what can we do with .NET API? Automate tasks. It has really good interop with MaxScript, so you can create really nice geometry routines in a debuggable .NET API environment. And then you could give those routines maybe to someone else who's going to code some MaxScript and they can consume them. You can create really nice UI elements. The markup tools for WPF are really, really nice using the XAML language. And other .NET API components, we'll take a look at using LINQ as an example of things that make programming in .NET really nice that you don't get even in C++. So there's one important thing to avoid. So because the wrapper assembly is a one-to-one mapping of the C++ SDK, and if you remember when we talked about the C++ SDK, you derive from our base classes to get a specific plugin type, that mechanism does not work in .NET API. So you should not create a plugin derived from anything in the Autodesk.Max plugins type. Okay? So you'll see in plugins, for example, utility object. You might be tempted, oh, I want to create a utility object, derive from it, and it will show up in the panel, in the utility panel. It might work, but it's not supported, and we've had a lot of problems with people trying it. So what ended up happening is our engineering team, when I started asking questions about this, they said, what do you mean people are deriving from this? We didn't expose that. But they made a mistake and they did expose it. And so unfortunately the wrapper, the internal tool that creates the wrappers, just covers the entire SDK, and it was something that they didn't intend on. So we just make sure you take this away as something you should not do. Okay? If you want that type of plugin, use C++, because it'll work there. And that's where it's supported. So just a few tips and tricks before we look at some sample code. When using CLI Action Command Adapter, you'll see that over and over again you have to implement kind of the same thing. So for example, you have to implement an internal category string and a category string. So every time you create a new action, a new command, if you will, you have to implement that. Where in most cases your category is going to be the same for all your actions. So what I suggest is make a custom abstract base class that has the category implemented in one place, and then derive from your abstract class to make each action. Okay? It just makes it convenient, gives you a little bit tighter code base, and that also guarantees your categories will always be the same. So you won't have different categories because you typed in a different name or you made a typo or something. So then when you do this methodology, the only thing that's unique that you'll implement is an execute and the action text itself. Those are the two things per action that are really unique. Category can be the same, but you need an action string for each command to name it differently, and you need an execute body to get the different body of code to execute. So we can take a quick look at that. This is exactly how the sample code is implemented. So you can see here that I create an abstract class called abstract custom underscore CUI action command adapter, and it derives from the base, okay, the Max API one. So override all the things that need to be implemented. So in this case, the action text, return the internal action text, category, internal category. Here's the internal category, and it's implemented as ADN samples. So I did that once. I don't have to worry about it again. And execute is going to call my custom execute. Okay. So then this abstract class, I put two abstract requirements in, which are just the things that I need to make that action unique going forward. So in this case, we need an action text, and we need a custom execute. Okay. So then when we use it, we're deriving from this new class, and the only thing that's implemented that's a requirement is the action text and the execute. Okay. So it's just a tip to make things a little bit easier when you get started, especially you don't want to have to deal with making a new category every time. Some other tips and tricks. Use the Visual Studio tools. There's an implement abstract, for example. Use the object browser. We looked at that. As far as error checking goes, the .NET typical way of error checking is to use try and catch blocks. So you say try this body of code, and if there's an error, the API will throw an exception, and you trap the exceptions that you can handle, and you do something with it, and any other exceptions you let go and pass back. So this does work, and you can do that, and I would encourage you to get in the habit of always doing a try-catch around the code. But you also need to remember that these are wrappers around the C++ code, and in some cases the return value might indicate an error condition or some other special case that you need to handle appropriately. So remember to do this as well. And also check for null. Because this is using kind of the C++ style of especially things like object identification, you can do things like cast to a specific type, and if the object isn't that type, it will be null. And if you then try to call an API on that type, it compiles fine, but at runtime it'll give you a crash because you're trying to execute off of a null object type. So always check for null when you're doing casts, and when something is returning an object of a specific type, check to see if it returned null before you actually use that object. And also remember to use all the assemblies where appropriate. So I had a customer, for example, who was really excited about the new enhanced API. They referenced autodesk.max.dll, and they thought, well, this is the entire SDK, so that's the only assembly I need. And you can do almost everything with that one assembly, but in some cases it's harder to get things done, and these other assemblies have helpers that make it much nicer. So don't get stuck just using that one assembly. Use them all together, and they're made to interop. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some sample code. We already looked at this example 1. So it was basically using the CUI action command adapter to execute the code. It shows how to get the iGlobal instance, how to get core interface, and use the core interface functionality. So let's just take a quick look at this code. You saw it step in here. First thing I did was Autodesk.max, global interface, and I'm getting the global instance of that interface in this running instance. Okay, so that gives me an iGlobal that's valid. Now you'll see I didn't check for null in this case. So most of these samples don't have error checking just to make the code easy to understand. So if you take any of this sample code back with you and you put it into production, make sure you put in the correct error checking. Okay, because I did not do that. So you should be checking things for null when they come back. So I've got a global instance, and now I can go from the global instance and get core interface 14. Okay, so that's my I interface. And this gives me access to 3ds Max application. iGlobal gives me access to creating types like the I point and the matrices and things like that that are types that help you to work with the APIs. The interface actually gives you the access to 3ds Max as an application. So it's going to be the starting point for getting access to the scene, selected nodes, all that kind of stuff. Let's see. So now we'll take a look at a real example that's doing something useful. So this one shows how to configure and display a WPF dialog. So it's a very basic dialog. We'll use WPF functionality along with 3ds Max functionality to display the last rendered animation. And then it also has some a separate functionality to create some scene geometry and add a modifier. So let's go ahead and run this. Before I run it, I just want to point out that the way the action text hooks into the user interface is through this string. To create this menu, I went to Customize User Interface, and the category was ADN Samples. Okay, so you can see that there's multiple categories here. For example, the CAT system has a category of its commands. My category was ADN Samples. And all of those actions that I've defined in the sample code are displayed here. Okay? To add it to a menu, I just went over here to the menu and I created a new menu entry and I dragged each one of those actions over here. So I kind of set this up manually just to give us a starting point to call them. So this is the menu that I created that way. I'm going to call example number 2. So I'm jumping into the custom execute for O2 WPF quick sample. The first thing I'm going to do is I need to take the WPF panel that I'm creating and I need to host it somewhere so that I can display it. So WPF by itself is just user interface elements, and you have to host it somewhere. So I'm using the Windows system dialog, the window type, to create a frame for my WPF panel. So that frame will have a typical window, so it will have the title and the little controls on that window, etc., to display it. So I need to configure that. So using the Windows tools, I set the title, I set up the height and width. The content of this is my WPF control. So if I go and look at the definition for this, you'll see this is the control derived off of the Windows Presentation Foundation user control base type. Okay, so that contains my content that is displayed in that dialog. Okay, and then I need to set up some interop because 3ds Max itself is a native application. It's not primarily a managed app. So I have to do some interop, and Windows has this window interop helper class. And so I just create a helper using this dialog that I constructed. Okay, so I'm getting a helper object back that I can use to configure the window within Max to work properly and be hosted and have focus and that sort of thing within the Max parent window. So then I can go to this helper inside of the Managed Services assembly, and I can get the Max HWind. Okay, so this allows me to then go configure the window for Max using the dialog, and I'm taking this interop helper and making the owner the Max window. Okay, so that hooks that window into Max is app frame as a parent. If I didn't do that, and I popped up the dialog, and then I clicked in Max, the dialog would go behind the Max window. Even though it's still running in the Max process, you wouldn't see it anymore, and it could be confusing to the user. So just these few little steps here allow the window to stay on top of Max at all times and have the proper focus. And then when I'm all done, all I do is show it. So let's go ahead and run this. So this part of it is the window frame that I created. And inside of that is the WPF code. Okay? So this one is just using WPF functionality. Okay, so I can push and hold the button and I can pop up some text. And that's just using the WPF data binding. So if I look at the XAML for this, so this is the XAML markup language. So you can see that it's a user control and it's called Create Teapot User Control 01. And the way XAML works with your language is it creates what's called a partial class. So you have part of it defined in the XAML markup language and handling code in C# language. All right? So here, that button that said hello, you can see its definition is here. And let's see. Right here, you can see its visibility is using a binding element so that when the button's path is pressed, it will display, and when the button is let go, it drops. So that's all WPF functionality, and that's just kind of a nice way of creating modern user interfaces where you have this access to data binding and the different WPF functionality. The next example, I'm going to create some geometry. So I push that button, and now you can see I'm in the C# code for handling that. So now I'm using this button handler to go and get my iGlobal instance, get my core interface. I can do a push prompt like I did before. But what I really want to do is create the teapot. Let me make this just a little bit bigger. So you remember I said you had to use class IDs to create something. So what I'm doing here is there's a class ID type that's in the max assembly. I'm going to go off of my global, and I know I want to create a class ID, so I go global.classid.create. Okay, so you remember whenever you create these immutable types, you have to do it this way. So this could be a 0.3, for example. Okay, and then the create method for this type is going to have specific parameters to actually construct that type properly. So we use class IDs to identify things, and most class IDs are defined by some sort of type definition. Okay, so there are usually two components as well. So a class ID is made up of part A, which is an integer value, and part B, which is an integer value. And this defines the unique identification system within 3ds Max. And any object type will have a unique class ID. So it just so happens that teapot is a built-in, so we can say built-in class ID, A component, teapot class ID, and then here's the B component. And they are integers that need to go into create. So after we call this, we'll now have a class ID for identifying the teapot. All right. So once we have the class ID, then we can create an instance of the teapot. Okay, let me just step to the next line. Oh, I clicked it too fast. So we're looking at this line right here. So we go back to our core interface, and we say create instance. Here's the class ID for the teapot. Create instance says, okay, what object type do you want? And you also have to tell it what superclass ID it is. So there's a third component here. There's an A and B plus the superclass ID, and these are always built in. Everything has to, this is basically what class the teapot is derived from. All right? So there's the teapot class ID. We're going to pass in the geom object because we can look in the SDK and know that teapot has a superclass of geom object. Okay? And that's going to return an iObject interface. So the next thing we have to do, we've created this teapot in memory. There's an instance of it now, but we haven't put it anywhere. We have to put it in the scene somehow. So scene objects are owned by a node. Okay, so there's the node itself that contains an object reference. So what we can do is we can go back to the core interface and we can say, because we're creating a new object, we're going to create a new node that's referencing this object. So there's an API called create object node. We pass in the teapot object. So now we've got a node in the scene and we've assigned it that teapot. And at this point it'll display. It's in the scene, but it will have basic default parameters. Okay, so whatever it initializes its size to, whatever the default viewport orientation is, etc., it's going to show in that basic form. So once we created it and we get it into the scene, we probably want to set some specific data on it. So the way 3ds Max works is all the data are stored in what's called a parameter block. Okay, and the parameter block contains parameters that have the data in it. So what we have to do is go to the teapot object and get its param block. Okay, and depending on how old the object is in the historical legacy of 3ds Max can define what type of parameter block comes back. So in this case, it's an older parameter block called a param array. So it's just an array of parameters. So we get that back, and now we can go into the parameter block and we can set a specific value. Okay? So because this is a parameter array, the values are just an indexed array, and you need to know its index of the parameter you want to change. So this is also where the SDK will help you a lot to figure that out. So the teapot size is at index 0. All right? So I say set value of a parameter that's at index 0, and then you pass in the time that you want to set it, because values can be animated as well, and then the value itself. So in this case, I'm going to set it to 20 units. Right? So now that gives it a size. And then we probably want to position it somewhere in space as well. So the way Max positions things is through matrices. So the first thing you need to do is create a matrix. So we go back to iGlobal. We're going to create a matrix 3. Okay, and that's going to give me a basic initialized matrix. Okay. So just to make sure it's got the values that I want to start with, I can say identity matrix. And then I go back to the node that I created earlier that's referencing it. And the node defines its position in space. So the object itself doesn't have a position. It's the node that positions it. So I say node, and I'm going to move the object from its current location at this time using that matrix. So identity matrix, it just means I'm going to move it a linear value. So I go back and create a point 3 this time. So global point 3 create, and point 3 is 3 values. So I'm going to move it in the x direction, nothing in the y, and nothing in the z. Okay, so that's going to position it at x10. All right, so let's run through that. And then we're going to add a modifier to it as well. So the modifier itself is an object in itself, right? So we have to go back and we have to say, okay, I want to add a modifier. I want to add the bend modifier. So I have to create an object, a class ID again, okay, to identify it. So I construct my class ID, built-in class ID A, bend, OSM class ID. In this particular case, it doesn't have a B component, so it just happens to be 0. So now I've got the class ID for the bend. And what I do is I go back to the node and I get the object referenced by the node. Okay? I could just go back and get the teapot because I know that's what I'm working on. But this just shows you how on an existing node you can still get the object reference and apply a modifier to it. So I get the object back. And the way 3ds Max works is we have this internal idea for the graphics pipeline for the modifier stack called derived object. So there's the base object in its original state, and then what we do is we create a copy of that called a derived object, and that's where the modifier is applied. And that's what allows you to move the stack around and still have access to the original component of the object. Okay, because we never modify the original. So we create a derived object, and now we have a new derived object. And then we go back and we say, create instance of the bend modifier. And we need to make it a modifier. So this is one of those situations where we just do a direct cast on it. And so you definitely want to check this for null before you use it. And then we go back to the derived object and we say add modifier, and that's the modifier that we created. So what's happened here is we've got the original object reference, we've got a derived object, and then we've put the modifier on that derived object. So the geometry deformation is going to happen on the derived one. And again, when you go back into the Max UI, that's what allows you to go back to the original geometry and look at it and edit it separately from the modified version. All right, so we've added the modifier. We need to go back to the node's object reference when we put the derived object in there, so that now the node is pointing to the modified geometry, and that's what gives us the display capability. And then again, we probably want to set some parameters on that modifier. So we'll go to the modifier and we'll get the param block. Now, this modifier happens to be a newer geometry type or a newer type of object. So it's a little different here. Instead, we get a param block 2 instead of that I param array. Okay? So depending on the object type, it may return a different type of parameter block. So this is where, again, you have to go back to the SDK documentation to determine exactly what you're getting back. So we can do the same thing. So we've got the param block, set value at index 0, and we're going to give it a bend angle of 30. And once everything is done, we've done some creation, we've transformed the geometry to a new location, we've added a modifier. It's a good idea to redraw the viewport so that we get graphics update, and then we clear the prompt. So let's just run that through. And there's the teapot with the bend applied to it. Okay? And when I select it and I go over here, you can see it's a modifier that was added to the original teapot. The modifier itself, if I select this, you can see there's the angle 30 that I applied to it. Okay? I think we're almost to lunch. So let me just run this last one real quick. So this is using a little different portion of the API. So instead of going into the interface pointer, what I can do is off global, I can get access to some global data too. In this case, I'm going to go to the Path Configuration Manager, and I'm going to get the directory for the 3ds Max assets. So in this case, it is the render output directory. All right, so I'll get the render output directory. What I can do is take that string that comes back, and I can use some .NET framework tools to convert that string to something that's more useful, like directory info. And this is where you could use tools like link. So this is not 3ds Max per se. This is just using the .NET link facility, and I can do database style queries on this directory data. So I can say, from the file in this directory, get files that has the pattern of star.avi, order by, and this is basically saying the last write time. So that's saying, okay, give me the last file written. I'm sorting it by descending. What I'm going to do is select the first one. So I've ordered it by time, and that's a list ordered in a specific way, and I can just say, give me the first one. And this whole thing will give me the last written file in that directory, and it's just one line of code. So that's just one of the really powerful things about .NET API that makes life really easy. So I'm just going to run this. And what it did was it went and got the last rendered file, and it's just playing it using the WPF media player. So I embedded the media player in the WPF dialog, and it just allows you to preview your last rendered file in a very convenient way. So not too much coding there. You can see that block of code was really short, and to do this in C++, it'd be 100 lines of code minimum. All right. So that brings us back here. So there's other examples in this sample code. So we'll get the sample code to you, and you can take a look at that. For resources, this is the same web resources we talked about earlier. This is the best place to get answers that is not part of the ADN program. Of course, if you join ADN, at the membership, we'll do the technical support. The ADN open page is Develop 3ds Max, and there's a lot of resources there that will help you get started with .NET API. We're planning to do some Dev TV type stuff with Max.NET API in the future. And again, I gave you my email address. If you have follow-up questions, please let me know, and I can help you with it. All right. So any questions we want to answer while we're here? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope it was useful. Thank you.